Canada has 3 ocean coastlines and 166 billion barrels of oil. Yet 98% of its crude exports flow to a single buyer at a $15 to $25 billion annual discount. There are 5 mechanisms locking this cage shut. Picture the boardroom at Imperial Oil's Calgary headquarters. On the screen, WCS crude trading at $63 per barrel. Same day, Brent crude, chemically identical, closes at $78. The $15 spread isn't a market fluctuation, it's the cost of captivity. Every pipeline radiates south, Northern Gateway to the Pacific, cancelled. Energy east to the Atlantic, cancelled. Trans Mountain expansion, 12 years delayed, still incomplete. The USMCA treaty embeds a clause, Article 32.10, giving the United States veto power over Canadian trade deals with China. The question isn't whether Canada is locked in a geographic cage, it's whether Canadians understand the 5 mechanisms that built it, and why those mechanisms won't break without an external shock Canada cannot create alone. This is Mechanism 1, the single exit trap. Here's why this matters to you. Every time a Canadian oil producer sells a barrel at a $15 discount, that's lost government revenue, revenue that could fund healthcare, schools, or lower taxes. Multiply that by 4.3 million barrels per day, and you're looking at $15 to $25 billion annually walking out the door. Now here's the boardroom reality. Canada is a Pacific nation. British Columbia's coastline faces Asia, the world's fastest growing energy market. China, India, Japan, South Korea, all willing to pay global Brent prices, on which run $12 to $18 per barrel higher than what U.S. refineries pay for Canadian crude. But here's what's on the map. 0 operational crude export terminals on the Pacific. 0 on the Atlantic. Every major pipeline radiates south to the United States. Imagine you're in the Imperial Oil boardroom in Calgary. The CFO pulls up a map of North American pipeline infrastructure. Red lines everywhere: Keystone, Enbridge, Trans Mountain, Original, Express, Flanagan South. Every single line terminates in U.S. refinery hubs: Cushing, Oklahoma, Houston, Texas, the Gulf Coast. Now zoom out to the Pacific coastline. 25,000 kilometers of British Columbia shoreline facing Asia. The map shows nothing. No terminals, no loading facilities, no pipeline capacity to tidewater. The infrastructure lock-in happened in stages. In the 1950s through 1980s, oil sands development required massive capital. U.S. energy companies, Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, provided it. But the deal came with routing requirements, what we call vendor financing in deal language. Pipelines had to terminate at U.S. refineries where these companies had existing capacity. By 2000, the pattern was set. Canada produced 2.8 million barrels per day, 99% flowing south. Then oil sands expansion accelerated. Production hit 4.3 million barrels per day by 2019. But pipeline capacity to the U.S. didn't grow proportionally. It hit bottlenecks. The bottleneck should have triggered price convergence through basic supply and demand. It didn't. Instead, Canadian crude started trading at historically unprecedented discounts, $40 to $50 per barrel below Brent during peak bottleneck periods in 2018 and 2019. The WCS-WTI spread, normally $5 to $8, blew out to a $15 to $18 structural average. Why? Because Canadian producers are price takers in a monopsony. One buyer, no alternatives. The U.S. Gulf Coast refineries specifically built to process heavy Canadian crude can dictate terms. Here's what this means for you. Alberta's energy royalties fund 20 to 25% of the provincial budget. A $15 per barrel discount on 3 million barrels per day. Alberta's share equals $16 billion annually in lost revenue. That's $4,000 per Alberta household in foregone public services, or higher taxes compensating for the shortfall. Scale that nationally. $15 to $25 billion per year doesn't stay in Canada. It flows to U.S. refinery margins. The discount cascades. Lower wellhead prices mean Canadian energy companies trade at lower valuations than U.S. shale producers. That means higher capital costs when they try to borrow for expansion, which means they stay dependent on U.S. financing, which reinforces infrastructure routing south. Asian energy companies, Sinopec, CNOOC, Japan's JXTG. Watch this and see opportunity. They offer long-term contracts at Brent equivalent prices, but they need one thing, a pipeline to Tidewater. You might be thinking, can't Canada just build a pipeline to the Pacific and solve this? Here's the problem with that assumption. 3 major pipeline projects attempted exactly that in the last 15 years. Northern Gateway to Kitimat, SBC, cancelled 2016. Energy East to St. John, New Brunswick, cancelled 2017. Trans Mountain expansion to Burnaby, BC, approved 2019, still not operational in 2025, $30 billion over budget. The single exit trap isn't just geography, it's geography plus the mechanisms that prevent escape. The infrastructure exists as a map. The question is who holds veto power over turning those maps into actual pipelines? And that's just mechanism 1, the physical cage. Mechanism 2 is the legal covenant that makes the cage permanent. This is mechanism 2, the covenant lock-in. Here's why this matters to you. The fastest growing consumer market on Earth is Asia Pacific, 2.3 billion people in the RCEP trade bloc, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Canada is locked out of signing a trade deal with China or joining RCEP without permission from the United States. That means your job in manufacturing, agriculture, or resources is stuck selling to a market of 330 million Americans instead of accessing 4.5 billion potential customers in Asia Pacific. The mechanism lives in USMCA Article 32.10, ratified in 2020. The clause is titled Non-Market Country FTA, and it's 129 words long. Here's what it does. If Canada signs a free trade agreement with a non-market economy, the United States can terminate USMCA with 6 months' notice. Picture the Global Affairs Canada Trade Negotiation Office in Ottawa, March 2025. A team is preparing for exploratory talks with Chinese officials about a bilateral trade agreement. On the whiteboard, potential gains. China is Canada's second largest trading partner at $100 billion annually, but that's mostly raw materials flowing west, canola, lumber, potash, and manufactured goods flowing east, electronics, and machinery. A trade deal could double that. Preferential access for Canadian agriculture, energy, and services into a market of 1.4 billion consumers. China offers premium prices for LNG, crude oil, uranium, all the things Canada produces but currently sells mostly to the United States at discounted rates. The lead negotiator pulls up USMCA Article 32.10 on the screen. The room goes quiet. Article 32.10 doesn't explicitly name China. It uses the term non-market economy, WTO, classification language. But the drafting history is clear. This clause exists to prevent Canada and Mexico from pivoting trade relationships toward China. Yet the penalty structure is asymmetric. If Canada signs a China FTA, the US can exit USMCA with 6 months' notice. That triggers immediate tariffs on $450 billion in annual Canada-US trade, collapse of just-in-time auto supply chains, where 60% of Canadian manufacturing exports are involved, loss of agricultural market access for dairy, beef, and grains, and termination of energy export arrangements. Then comes the kicker. USMCA Article 34.7 includes a 10-year renegotiation ban. If the US exits, Canada cannot renegotiate a new trade agreement with the United States for a decade. So the choice is binary. Keep USMCA and forget about China trade deals, or sign a China FTA and lose the US market for 10 years. Here's what this means for you. Canada's 400,000 auto manufacturing jobs depend on USMCA rules of origin, counted specifically the 75% North American content requirement. If USMCA terminates, those jobs disappear within 18 months as plants relocate to the US or Mexico. Your pension fund holds Canadian auto supplier stocks, Magna, Linamar, that lose 40 to 60% of their value overnight if market access vanishes. The covenant doesn't just lock in current trade flows, it prevents Canada from diversifying away from dependency. Asian governments watch this and draw conclusions. When South Korea negotiated with Canada through CKFTA in 2015, they included provisions for future expansion. But expansion clauses now hit Article 32.10 barriers. Japan's CPTPP membership with Canada excludes energy, the sector where Japan would pay premiums, because any energy trade deal risks U.S. classification as threatening USMCA. The result? Canada negotiates trade agreements with Asian partners, but they're hollow, covering sectors where Canada has no competitive advantage while excluding the resource exports where Canada could command premium pricing. You might be thinking, can't Canada just negotiate around Article 32.10? Call it something other than a free trade agreement. Here's the problem. The clause defines free trade agreement broadly, any accord that reduces tariffs or expands market access. Bilateral investment treaties, sectoral agreements, even MOU-level cooperation on energy trade could trigger U.S. interpretation as FTA equivalent. And here's the enforcement mechanism. The U.S. doesn't need to prove Canada violated Article 32.10 in a tribunal. The clause gives unilateral exit rights. Terminate first, litigate later. By the time a USMCA panel rules, which takes 18 to 24 months, the damage is done. Auto plants closed, supply chains relocated, investors fled. That's the legal cage. Now here's how the United States enforces it. Mechanism 3, the infrastructure veto. This is Mechanism 3, the infrastructure veto. Here's why this matters to you. High-paying energy sector jobs, engineers, construction workers, pipeline operators, go to the U.S. Gulf Coast instead of Canadian facilities because Canada can't build the infrastructure to move oil to Tidewater. The Trans Mountain expansion, which would have created 15,000 direct construction jobs, has been delayed 12 plus years and counting. Those jobs went to U.S. pipeline projects instead. The veto operates through two channels: formal cross-border permit authority and informal regulatory interference. The year is 2015. TransCanada Corporation submits the final application for Keystone XL, a pipeline carrying 830,000 barrels per day from Alberta to Nebraska, then connecting to existing lines to the Gulf Coast. The application sits on the desk of the U.S. State Department. Secretary of State John Kerry reviews the environmental assessment. 11,000 pages. The Canadian government watches. Keystone XL isn't about new market access. It's about expanding existing southbound capacity. Alberta's production is growing. Pipeline bottlenecks are already creating the price discounts. Keystone XL would relieve some pressure. But here's what the State Department sees. If Keystone XL proceeds, it locks in Canadian crude, flowing to U.S. refineries for another 50 years, the typical pipeline lifespan. But if Keystone XL is rejected, bottlenecks worsen, AWCS discounts deepen, and Canadian producers become desperate for any infrastructure, which makes them more amenable to U.S. terms on everything else. Remember, USMCA negotiations are 2 years away. November 2015, Keystone XL permit denied. Official reason: climate concerns. The real mechanism: leveraging Canadian infrastructure desperation. The formal veto works like this. Any pipeline crossing the U.S.-Canada border requires a presidential permit from the U.S. State Department. The permit process includes environmental review under NEPA, consultation with affected states, and a national interest determination. National interest is undefined. It means whatever the sitting administration wants it to mean. For Keystone XL, the Obama administration decided that facilitating Canadian oil sands expansion wasn't in U.S. national interest, using climate as the rationale. The Trump administration reversed this in 2017, approved the permit. The Biden administration re-revoked it in 2021, killing the project permanently. That's the formal channel. The informal veto is more insidious. When Canada proposes pipelines that don't cross the U.S. border, Northern Gateway from Alberta to Kitimat, BC, or Energy East from Alberta to New Brunswick, the U.S. can't directly veto, but it can fund interference. U.S.-based environmental organizations Sierra Club, NRDC, 350.org receive funding, some traceable to U.S. foundations with energy sector interests, and deploy to Canada. They coordinate with Canadian Indigenous groups and provincial environmental movements. The playbook: delay projects through legal challenges, public protests, and regulatory reviews until economics collapse from cost overruns and withdrawn financing. Northern Gateway, approved 2014, cancelled 2016 after sustained protests and Indigenous legal challenges. Cost to Enbridge, $500 million in sunk capital. Energy East, cancelled 2017 after TransCanada couldn't secure financing. Lenders cited regulatory uncertainty, which is code for endless environmental reviews triggered by opposition campaigns. Here's what this means for you. Energy East would have created a tidewater terminal in New Brunswick, allowing Canadian crude to reach European and Asian buyers. That would have supported $15 to $20 per barrel higher prices, eliminating the WCS discount. On 1 million barrels per day, Energy East's capacity, that's $5 to $7 billion annually in additional revenue that funds royalties, corporate taxes, and job creation. Instead, that $5 to $7 billion stays in U.S. refinery margins. Your tax bill is higher because energy royalties are lower. The infrastructure veto creates a chilling effect. Canadian energy companies now hesitate to propose new Pacific or Atlantic pipelines, not because they're unprofitable, but because the probability of completion is too low to justify the $10 to $15 billion capital requirement and 10-year development timeline. So capital flows to smaller projects, expansions of existing southbound pipelines, where U.S. regulatory approval is more predictable. This reinforces the single exit trap, Mechanism 1. The infrastructure veto doesn't just block alternatives, it ensures Canadian capital entrenches existing dependency. You might be thinking, but Trans Mountain expansion was approved and is being built. Doesn't that prove Canada can create Pacific export capacity? Here's the problem. Trans Mountain expansion was approved in 2016. It's now 2025 and the pipeline still isn't operational. Original cost estimate, $7.4 billion. Current cost, over $30 billion. Timeline, 12 plus years and counting. Why? Because approval doesn't eliminate opposition. Indigenous groups have filed 15 plus legal challenges. Environmental protesters have delayed construction repeatedly. And here's the key. Much of the opposition funding and legal strategy comes from U.S.-based organizations with documented ties to U.S. energy interests. Even when Canada wins approval, the veto operates as delay until uneconomic. By the time Trans Mountain is operational, the window for long-term Asian supply contracts may have closed. Asian buyers have signed deals with U.S. LNG and Middle Eastern suppliers instead. That's the infrastructure veto, the enforcement mechanism. But the cage has two more layers. Mechanism 4, the border dependency that makes exit economically catastrophic. This is Mechanism 4, the border dependency. Here's why this matters to you. 400,000 Canadian jobs depend on just-in-time supply chains that cross the U.S. border multiple times before a finished product emerges. If those supply chains are disrupted by tariffs, regulatory changes, or border delays, those jobs disappear within months because Canadian factories can't pivot to Asian markets overnight. The infrastructure doesn't exist. 3/4 of Canada's population lives within 100 miles of the U.S. border. That's not an accident. It's the result of 150 years of infrastructure investment, radiating south, not east-west. Pull up a population density map of Canada. The country is 9.98 million square kilometers, second largest by land area. But zoom in on where people actually live. A thin band along the U.S. border, the Quebec City-Windsor corridor holds 60% of Canada's population. Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, another 10%. The rest, everything north of the 50th parallel, holds 3% of the population. Now overlay transportation infrastructure. Every major highway, Trans-Canada Highway, runs east-west, but the high-volume trucking routes run north-south to U.S. border crossings. Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit and Windsor handles 25% of all Canada-U.S. trade. Peace Bridge between Buffalo and Fort Erie. Pacific Highway crossing between Blaine and Surrey. Rail networks, Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Railways operate 46,000 kilometers of track. The majority of freight tonnage isn't internal Canadian shipments. It's cross-border to the U.S. or through shipments between U.S. cities using Canadian rail as a shortcut. The dependency compounds through just-in-time manufacturing. Here's how it works. A car engine block is cast in a foundry in Windsor, Ontario. It crosses the Ambassador Bridge to a plant in Michigan for machining. The machine block crosses back to Windsor for assembly into an engine. The engine crosses again to a Michigan transmission plant. The assembled engine transmission unit crosses back to an Ontario assembly plant for final vehicle assembly. That vehicle crosses back to the U.S. for sale at a dealership. Total border crossings for one car, 6 to 8 times. Now add Canadian auto parts suppliers into the mix. Linamar for machined components, Magna for full vehicle systems. They operate on 24 to 48-hour delivery windows. A single border delay, customs backup, new inspection requirements, shuts down assembly lines on both sides within days. This is true across sectors. Aerospace, Bombardier's C-Series, now the Airbus A220, has a supply chain that crosses the border 15 plus times during production. Agriculture, Canadian beef cattle cross to U.S. feedlots for finishing, then cross back to Canadian packing plants, then cross again for U.S. grocery distribution. On electricity, Ontario's grid is integrated with Michigan, New York, and PJM interconnection. Quebec exports hydropower to New England. Real-time balancing requires cross-border flows. The result, $2.7 billion in goods crosses the Canada-US border every single day. That's 75% of Canada's total trade. Here's what this means for you. If USMCA terminates, which is Mechanism 2's penalty, those just-in-time supply chains collapse. Automotive assembly lines shut down within 72 hours because parts inventories are kept minimal to reduce costs. Your RRSP holds Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board assets, which are heavily weighted toward auto suppliers and cross-border logistics companies. Those valuations crater 40 to 60% overnight. Unemployment in Ontario's manufacturing belt hits 15% plus within 6 months. The 2008 to 2009 financial crisis saw 8%. That's your neighbor losing their job, your town's tax base collapsing, your home value dropping. The border dependency creates a political lock-in. Canadian federal politicians can't credibly threaten to exit USMCA or retaliate against U.S. trade restrictions because the economic pain is immediate and concentrated in vote-rich constituencies. Ontario's manufacturing belt, Quebec's aerospace corridor. U.S. politicians know this. When trade disputes arise, softwood lumber tariffs, dairy quotas, Buy American procurement rules, Canada negotiates from a position of weakness. The threat of border disruption is always implicit. Accept our terms or we slow down border processing and your economy seizes within a week. You might be thinking, can't Canada just diversify its trade over time? Reduce dependency on the U.S. gradually. Here's the problem. The infrastructure lock-in makes diversification prohibitively expensive. To pivot automotive manufacturing toward Asian markets, Canada would need Pacific port capacity for finished vehicle exports, which doesn't exist at scale. Right-hand drive production lines for Japan, Australia, and UK markets, which requires $500 million plus per assembly plant retrofit. Shipping logistics that are cost competitive with U.S. rail, which isn't feasible. Ocean shipping to Asia is 3 to 4 weeks versus 2-day truck to U.S. markets. And trade agreements with Asian buyers that overcome USMCA, Article 32.10 restrictions, which is blocked by Mechanism 2. Timeframe to build this alternative infrastructure, 10 to 15 years. Capital required, $50 to $100 billion. And a political will required, sustained federal-provincial coordination. Which brings us to Mechanism 5, the provincial fragmentation that guarantees Canada can't coordinate such a pivot. That's the border dependency, the economic cage that makes exit catastrophic. Now here's the final mechanism, the internal division that prevents escape. This is Mechanism 5, the divide and conquer exploit. Here's why this matters to you. When Quebec blocks a pipeline that would create 15,000 jobs in Alberta and New Brunswick, or when BC Indigenous groups block a pipeline that would raise Alberta's oil prices by $15 per barrel, the United States doesn't need to lift a finger. Canadians veto each other's economic opportunities, and U.S. refineries collect the $15 to $25 billion annual discount without opposition. The fragmentation is structural. And on Canada's Constitution from 1867, amended in 1982, grants provinces ownership of natural resources within their boundaries. This means Alberta owns its oil, Saskatchewan owns its potash, BC owns its natural gas. But interprovincial trade requires federal jurisdiction, and the Constitution is silent on whether provinces can block infrastructure crossing their territory. The year is 2014. TransCanada Corporation unveils the Energy East pipeline proposal. 4,500 kilometers from Alberta to New Brunswick, capacity of 1.1 million barrels per day. The route crosses 6 provinces. The economic case is overwhelming. $15 billion in construction capital, 15,000 jobs, tidewater access to European and Asian markets, eliminating the WCS discount. In Calgary, Alberta's energy minister celebrates. This is economic sovereignty. In Montreal, Quebec's environment minister responds, not through our territory. The veto isn't about environmental impact. The pipeline would use existing Trans-Canada natural gas pipeline routes, converted to crude service. It's about leverage. Quebec wants equalization payment formula changes. Quebec receives $13 billion annually from federal transfers funded partly by Alberta energy royalties. Hydroelectric export rights to U.S. markets, where Quebec wants to protect its electricity monopoly, and political cover with environmental voters, since blocking a pipeline plays well in Montreal ridings. The negotiation drags on for 3 years. TransCanada offers $1 billion in economic benefits to Quebec. Quebec's government demands veto power over future pipeline expansions. The economics collapse. 2017, Energy East cancelled. $3 billion sunk capital. 15,000 jobs evaporate. The provincial veto operates through 3 channels. First, constitutional resource ownership. Provinces own subsurface resources, controlling production rates, royalty structures, and export decisions. But they don't control interprovincial infrastructure. That's federal jurisdiction under trade and commerce powers. The ambiguity creates gridlock. Alberta can approve a pipeline to its border. But if Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, or Quebec refuse permits for the segment crossing their territory, the pipeline dies. Second, Indigenous consultation requirements. Section 35 of the Constitution Act from 1982 recognizes Indigenous rights and title. In courts have ruled that major resource projects crossing traditional territories require meaningful consultation with affected Indigenous groups. And if consultation fails, projects can be blocked. In practice, this gives Indigenous communities veto power. Northern Gateway, blocked by Gikson and Haida. First Nations at legal challenges. Trans Mountain expansion, delayed repeatedly by Tsleil Waututh and Squamish First Nations court cases. Third, provincial environmental reviews. Even if a pipeline receives federal approval, provinces can impose additional environmental assessments. Quebec and BC have used this repeatedly. BC's Environmental Assessment Office added 200-plus conditions to Northern Gateway approval, making the project uneconomic. Quebec's Bureau d'Audience Publique sur l'Environnement, BAP, launched multiple reviews of Energy East, each adding 18 to 24 months of delay. Here's what this means for you. The $15 billion that would have been invested in Energy East construction, that's 15,000 jobs paying $80,000 to $120,000 annually for 3 to 5 years. Those workers would have spent their wages in local economies, housing, restaurants, vehicles. Multiply that by the economic multiplier effect, where every dollar spent by a pipeline worker generates $1.50 to $2 in additional economic activity. And you're looking at $25 to $30 billion in total economic impact. Instead, that capital went to U.S. pipeline projects, Permian Basin expansions, Gulf Coast export terminals. Those are American jobs, American economic growth, and Canadian oil continues selling at a $15 per barrel discount, offers generating $15 to $25 billion annually that flows to U.S. refinery margins instead of Canadian provincial budgets. You might be thinking, can't the federal government just invoke national interest and override provincial vetoes? Here's the problem. Canada's political system makes this nearly impossible. The Liberal Party, currently governing, relies on seats in Quebec and urban Ontario to win elections. Forcing a pipeline through Quebec against provincial opposition would cost 30 to 40 seats in the next election, a guaranteed loss of government. The result? No federal party has the electoral math to override provincial vetoes. The fragmentation is politically locked in. Those are the 5 mechanisms. Here's why they won't break. Without an external shock, Canada cannot create alone. Those are the 5 mechanisms controlling Canada's resource cage. The single exit trap ensures 98% of crude flows to one buyer. The covenant lock-in prevents trade deals with alternative markets. The infrastructure veto blocks pipelines to tidewater. The border dependency makes exit economically catastrophic. The divide and conquer exploit ensures Canadians veto each other before external intervention is necessary. The result? $15 to $25 billion annually flows to U.S. refinery margins instead of Canadian provincial budgets. Your healthcare funding, your infrastructure investment, your energy sector jobs, all discounted. The mechanisms won't break without an external shock Canada cannot create alone. The question is whether Canadians recognize the cage before it's too late to escape.